The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune across the polished marble floors of Henderson and Associates, one of Chicago's most prestigious corporate law firms. At 11:45 on a Tuesday evening, the 32nd floor was nearly empty, save for the soft shuffle of worn sneakers against the gleaming surface and the gentle swish of a mop moving in practiced, methodical strokes. Marcus Williams had been cleaning these halls for 3 years now, and he knew every corner, every office, every hiding spot where dust dared to settle. His weathered hands, calloused from decades of honest work, gripped the mop handle with the same dignity he brought to everything in his 62-year-old life. The night shift suited him well. Fewer people meant fewer awkward encounters, fewer forced smiles, fewer moments when he had to pretend not to notice the way some employees looked right through him as if he were invisible. Tonight felt different, though. There was an electricity in the air, a tension that seemed to cling to the expensive mahogany paneling and designer furniture like static. Marcus had learned to read the moods of buildings the way others read facial expressions, and Henderson and Associates was practically vibrating with anticipation. Tomorrow marked the firm's most important client presentation of the year, a case that could secure millions in revenue and cement their reputation as the city's premier corporate defense team. Before we continue, tell us where you're listening from today in the comments below. If you enjoy stories with unexpected twists and moments of justice, please consider subscribing. As Marcus rounded the corner toward the executive wing, the sound of voices drifted from the conference room. The door stood slightly ajar, spilling golden light into the darkened hallway. He slowed his movements not out of curiosity, but out of professional courtesy. He'd learned long ago that lawyers often worked late into the night, and interrupting important conversations was the fastest way to lose a job he desperately needed. "I still can't believe we're trusting something this critical to the cleaning crew," came a voice Marcus recognized immediately. Richard Blackwell, the firm's managing partner, spoke with a kind of authority that came from never being questioned. His words carried the weight of Harvard law and 30 years of never losing a case that mattered. "These people aren't exactly known for their attention to detail." Marcus paused, his heart skipping slightly. The presentation materials. He'd seen the boxes stacked carefully in the conference room earlier that evening, marked with urgent red labels and strict handling instructions. Part of his job was to ensure those materials remained untouched, secure, and perfectly organized for tomorrow's meeting. "Come on, Richard," another voice chimed in, though with considerably less conviction. "The night cleaning staff has been reliable. No incidents, no problems. Besides, everything's locked up tight." Blackwell's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Reliable? Do you know what kind of background these people come from? Half of them probably can't even read the warning labels on the boxes, let alone understand the importance of what they're handling. We're talking about a $100 million case here, and we're trusting it to someone whose biggest career achievement was learning which end of a mop to hold." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, each syllable designed to diminish and dehumanize. His grip tightened on the mop handle until his knuckles went white. 37 years of working, from the steel mills of Gary, Indiana, to the office buildings of downtown Chicago, and this was how he was seen. Not as a man who had raised 3 children on his own after his wife died, not as someone who had worked multiple jobs to put his daughter through nursing school, not as a human being who took pride in honest work, no matter how others perceived it. But Marcus Williams had learned something valuable in his 6 decades on Earth. Sometimes the most powerful response was silence, observation, and patience. So he stood perfectly still in the shadows, listening as Blackwell continued his casual destruction of every night shift worker's dignity. "I mean, look at that old guy who's always shuffling around here," Blackwell went on, his voice growing more animated with each cruel word. "Marcus, I think his name is. Probably never saw the inside of a classroom past 8th grade. These people live in a completely different world from us. They don't understand consequences, responsibility, or the kind of pressure we're under. To them, this is just another building to clean, another paycheck to collect before they shuffle back to whatever government housing they crawled out of." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar burn of humiliation rise in his chest. But beneath the hurt, something else was stirring, a quiet determination that had sustained him through every hardship life had thrown his way. What Richard Blackwell didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Marcus Williams had been listening to more than just their conversation tonight. For weeks, he'd been inadvertently overhearing phone calls, reading documents left carelessly on desks, piecing together fragments of information that painted a very different picture of Henderson and Associates than their polished reputation suggested. And tomorrow's presentation, the one Blackwell was so worried about protecting from people like him, was built on a foundation that would crumble the moment the right person started asking the right questions. Marcus Williams had spent his entire life being underestimated, overlooked, and dismissed. Tomorrow, that would finally change. The first light of dawn painted the Chicago skyline in soft pastels as Marcus Williams sat at his small kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. His modest apartment in Bronzeville was quiet, except for the distant rumble of the L train carrying early commuters into the heart of the city. The morning newspaper lay folded beside his empty cereal bowl, but his attention was focused entirely on the yellow legal pad in front of him, filled with his careful handwriting. For the past 3 hours, Marcus had been reconstructing everything he'd seen and heard over the past several weeks. The overheard phone conversations, the documents glimpsed while emptying trash cans, the hushed meetings that suddenly went silent when he entered a room, it all formed a pattern that made his stomach churn with a mixture of anger and determination. Henderson and Associates wasn't just representing Meridian Industries in their wrongful death lawsuit. They were actively helping them cover up evidence that could change everything. The case centered around a chemical plant explosion that had killed 14 workers and injured dozens more. On the surface, it appeared to be a tragic accident caused by aging equipment and insufficient safety protocols. But Marcus had seen emails discussing bribes to safety inspectors, documents outlining the deliberate falsification of maintenance records, and recorded conversations where Meridian executives laughed about acceptable losses in their pursuit of higher profits. The most damning piece of evidence was a recorded phone call Marcus had overheard just last week. Richard Blackwell himself had been in his office, door closed, speaking to someone he addressed as Tom, likely Thomas Meridian, the company's CEO. The conversation had been brief but devastating. The family's lawyers are getting too close to the truth about the safety violations, Blackwell had said. We need to make sure certain documents disappear before discovery. Can't have them finding out you knew about the equipment failures 6 months before the explosion. Already handled, came the reply through the speakerphone. My people have been very thorough. The question is, can your people be equally thorough in making sure nobody asks the right questions? That's what you pay me for, Tom. Just make sure the check's clear. This kind of cleanup doesn't come cheap. Marcus had been emptying the trash can in the adjacent office, separated from Blackwell's private office by nothing more than a thin wall and an air vent. Every word had been crystal clear, and every word represented the kind of corruption that destroyed families and communities while enriching men who already had more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. Now, as he sat in his kitchen reviewing his notes, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. 14 families had lost fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters in that explosion. Dozens more were dealing with permanent injuries and medical bills that would follow them for the rest of their lives. And the lawyers they trusted to fight for justice were instead working hand in hand with the very people responsible for their suffering. The irony wasn't lost on him. Richard Blackwell saw him as nothing more than an uneducated janitor, someone whose, quote, biggest career achievement was learning which end of a mop to hold. What Blackwell didn't know was that Marcus Williams had once been a union organizer at the steel plant, a man who had spent years learning to spot corruption and fight back against the powerful interests that preyed on working families. After the plant closed and his world fell apart, Marcus had taken whatever work he could find to support his family. Cleaning offices wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work that paid the bills and kept food on the table. More importantly, it had given him something he'd never expected: invisibility. In a world where powerful people conducted their business behind closed doors, a black janitor was often as invisible as the furniture. Marcus glanced at the clock on his microwave. 7:37. In less than 3 hours, Richard Blackwell would stand before a panel of mediators and present his carefully crafted defense of Meridian Industries. He would paint his clients as the victims of unfortunate circumstances, tragic accidents that no amount of preparation could have prevented. He would argue for minimal settlements that wouldn't even cover the medical expenses of the survivors, let alone compensate the families of the dead. Unless someone stopped him. Marcus stood up slowly, his joints protesting after the long night of cleaning and the longer morning of planning. He walked to his bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of his dresser, pushing aside old photographs and mementos until his fingers found what he was looking for. The small digital recorder was barely larger than a matchbox, a gift from his daughter Sarah when she graduated nursing school. She'd given it to him so he could record his stories about her mother, family history she wanted to preserve for her own children someday. Today, it would serve a very different purpose. Marcus showered and dressed carefully, choosing his best pair of work pants and a clean shirt. He wanted to look professional, dignified, when he walked into that conference room. Not because he cared what Richard Blackwell thought of him. That man's opinion had ceased to matter the moment he revealed his true character, but because the people he was about to help deserved to see someone who took their fight seriously. As he prepared to leave for work, Marcus thought about his late wife, Elena. She had been a teacher in the Chicago public schools for 32 years, a woman who believed that knowledge was power, and that every person, regardless of their circumstances, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. Elena would have been proud of what he was about to do, even as she would have worried about the consequences. Because there would be consequences. Men like Richard Blackwell didn't lose gracefully, and they had resources Marcus could barely imagine. But some things were more important than personal safety, and justice for 14 dead workers and their families was one of them. Marcus Williams was about to remind the world that sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one nobody notices. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Henderson and Associates as Marcus Williams pushed his cleaning cart through the main entrance. The usual security guard, Jimmy Martinez, barely looked up from his newspaper as Marcus badged in, just another invisible worker starting another forgettable day. But today was different, and Marcus felt the weight of that difference in every step he took toward the elevator. The 32nd floor buzzed with nervous energy. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried between offices, their arms full of documents and their faces tight with concentration. Administrative assistants fielded phone calls with the kind of professional urgency that meant careers hung in the balance. Everyone was preparing for the Meridian Industries presentation, the case that would either cement Henderson and Associates' reputation as the city's premier corporate defense firm or raise uncomfortable questions about their methods. Marcus began his morning routine, emptying trash cans and dusting surfaces with the same methodical precision he brought to every workday. But today, his ears were tuned to every conversation, every whispered concern, every indication of where Richard Blackwell might be, and what his final preparations entailed. At 9:15, he found his answer. Blackwell's booming voice carried down the hallway as he barked orders at his team of junior associates. Marcus positioned himself in a supply closet with a clear view of the conference room, watching as boxes of evidence were arranged on tables and presentation boards were set up with military precision. "I want everything perfect," Blackwell was saying, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "The mediators arrive at 11, and I want them to walk into a room that screams competence and success. This case is worth more than some of your annual salaries, so act like it." A young associate, barely out of law school, struggled with a heavy box of documents. As she lifted it onto the table, the bottom gave way, spilling papers across the expensive Persian rug. The silence that followed was deafening. "Brilliant," Blackwell said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Absolutely brilliant. Do you have any idea what kind of sensitive information you just scattered across the floor like confetti? Some of these documents took months to acquire." The word acquire hung in the air with particular weight, and Marcus noticed how Blackwell's eyes darted around the room to see who might have heard him. The young associate scrambled to collect the papers, her face flushed with embarrassment and fear. "Everyone out," Blackwell commanded. "I'll handle this myself. And if any of you breathe a word about what just happened, you'll be looking for new jobs by lunch." The room emptied quickly, leaving Blackwell alone with the scattered documents. Marcus watched from the shadows as the senior partner knelt on the expensive rug, carefully sorting through papers with the kind of attention usually reserved for handling explosives. Some documents went into neat stacks on the table, while others, a much smaller pile, disappeared into Blackwell's briefcase. This was it. This was the moment Marcus had been waiting for, without even knowing it. As Blackwell gathered the last of the scattered papers, he left his briefcase open on the table while he arranged the presentation materials. The small digital recorder in Marcus's pocket seemed to burn against his chest, reminding him of the choice he was about to make. Marcus had spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility in this building. He could move through these halls like a ghost, cleaning around important meetings and sensitive conversations without anyone remembering he'd been there. Today, he would use that invisibility for something more important than mopping floors. He waited until Blackwell stepped into the adjacent office to take a phone call, then moved with the quiet efficiency that had kept him employed for 3 years. The supply closet had been his staging area, stocked with cleaning supplies that would provide the perfect cover for what he was about to do. "Yes, Tom, everything's under control," Blackwell's voice carried from the next room. "The problematic documents are secured, and the mediators will only see what we want them to see. By tonight, this whole mess will be behind us." Marcus slipped into the conference room, his cleaning cart providing the perfect disguise. To anyone watching, he was simply another invisible janitor, straightening up after the morning's chaos. But his hands moved with deliberate purpose as he approached Blackwell's open briefcase. The documents inside were exactly what he'd hoped to find, and exactly what he'd feared. Letters discussing bribes to safety inspectors, emails outlining the deliberate falsification of maintenance records, and most damning of all, a printed transcript of the recorded phone conversation he'd overheard last week. Meridian Industries and Henderson and Associates hadn't just covered up their knowledge of the safety violations that led to 14 deaths. They had documented their conspiracy in writing. The small digital recorder slipped easily behind the briefcase's leather lining, invisible but positioned perfectly to capture whatever conversation Blackwell might have with his co-conspirators. Before the presentation, Marcus had learned enough about the legal system during his years as a union organizer to know that recorded conversations, especially ones that captured criminal conspiracy, could change everything. "I understand the pressure you're under," Blackwell continued his phone conversation in the adjacent office, "but trust me, these families will take whatever settlement we offer. They're not sophisticated enough to understand what they're entitled to, and their lawyers are good but not great. By Christmas, this will all be a footnote in our annual report." Marcus felt his jaw clench at the casual dismissal of so much human suffering. These weren't footnotes in an annual report. They were fathers who would never walk their daughters down the aisle, mothers who would never see their children graduate, sons and daughters whose futures had been stolen by corporate greed and executive cowardice. As he put the finishing touches on his positioning of the recording device, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows. An old black man in work clothes, invisible to the powerful people who made decisions in rooms like this. For a moment, he felt the familiar sting of how the world saw him, or rather, how it didn't see him at all. But today, that invisibility was his greatest weapon. Richard Blackwell had no idea that his greatest threat wasn't another high-powered attorney or a team of investigators. It was a 62-year-old janitor who had learned to listen, to watch, and to act when justice demanded it. The sound of approaching footsteps sent Marcus back into motion, his cleaning routine resuming with practiced ease. By the time Blackwell returned to the conference room, Marcus was quietly dusting the windowsills, just another part of the furniture that powerful people noticed only when something was out of place. "Make sure you're finished in here by 10:30, Blackwell said without really looking at him. "We have important people coming, and I don't want any distractions." "Yes, sir," Marcus replied in the deferential tone that had protected him for 3 years. "I'll be long gone before your meeting starts." It was the first lie Marcus Williams had told in decades. In 2 hours, he would be closer to Richard Blackwell than the man could possibly imagine. The mediators arrived at Henderson and Associates with the kind of understated authority that came from years of resolving corporate disputes worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Dr. Patricia Chen, a former federal judge with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon, led the 3-person panel with quiet confidence. Her companions, Thomas Rodriguez, a corporate law expert with impeccable credentials, and Jennifer Walsh, a specialist in wrongful death cases, followed her into the building with the measured steps of people who held other people's fates in their briefcases. Richard Blackwell greeted them in the marble-appointed lobby, his charm polished to a mirror shine. He wore his most expensive suit, the one that had been custom-tailored in London, and his smile carried just the right mixture of professional confidence and personal warmth. This was his element, the high-stakes theater where legal careers were made or destroyed. "Dr. Chen, gentlemen, Ms. Walsh," Blackwell said, extending his hand with practiced grace. "Welcome to Henderson and Associates. I trust your flight from Washington was comfortable?" The pleasantries continued as they rode the elevator to the 32nd floor, but Marcus Williams wasn't there to hear them. He was 3 floors below in the building's service area, changing out of his work clothes and into the only suit he owned. A simple navy blue ensemble he'd purchased for his daughter Sarah's nursing school graduation 2 years ago. The transformation was remarkable. Without his janitor's uniform and cleaning cart, Marcus looked like what he had always been beneath the surface. A dignified man with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. He straightened his tie in the reflection of a supply room window and took a deep breath that tasted of determination and fear in equal measure. The service elevator carried him back to the 32nd floor, where the morning's frantic energy had settled into the tense quiet that preceded important presentations. Marcus knew the building's layout better than most of the lawyers who worked there, and he used that knowledge now to position himself perfectly. The conference room where Blackwell would make his presentation was adjacent to a smaller meeting room that was rarely used except for overflow storage. More importantly, the 2 rooms shared a wall that was thinner than it appeared, and the ventilation system carried sound between them with remarkable clarity. Marcus had discovered this acoustic anomaly months ago while cleaning late at night, overhearing conversations that he'd tried his best to ignore. Today, he would ignore nothing. At exactly 11 o'clock, Marcus heard the sound of chairs scraping against hardwood as the mediation began. Through the thin wall, Blackwell's voice carried with perfect clarity as he launched into his opening statement. "Dr. Chen, members of the panel," Blackwell began, his tone striking the perfect balance between gravitas and accessibility. "We gather today to discuss a tragedy that has affected multiple families and an entire community. The explosion at Meridian Industries' Chicago facility was devastating, and my client does not minimize the pain and suffering it has caused." Marcus listened as Blackwell painted a picture of Meridian Industries as a responsible corporation that had done everything possible to maintain safe working conditions. According to his carefully crafted narrative, the explosion was the result of an unforeseeable equipment failure, a tragic accident that no amount of preparation or inspection could have prevented. The safety protocols in place at the time of the incident exceeded industry standards. Blackwell continued, his voice carrying the confidence of a man who had never been successfully challenged. "My client invested millions of dollars in safety equipment, training programs, and regular inspections. This was not a case of corporate negligence or willful disregard for worker safety." Through the wall, Marcus could hear the sound of papers rustling as Blackwell presented his evidence. Official inspection reports showed no violations in the months leading up to the explosion. Maintenance records indicated that all equipment had been serviced according to manufacturer specifications. Employee testimony suggested that safety protocols had been followed religiously. What the mediators couldn't see, what they had no way of knowing, was that every piece of evidence Blackwell was presenting had been carefully curated or outright falsified. The real inspection reports, the ones that documented dozens of safety violations and equipment failures, were locked away in Blackwell's briefcase, not 10 feet from where the mediators sat. "The families affected by this tragedy deserve our compassion and our support," Blackwell said, his voice taking on a tone of calculated sympathy. "That's why Meridian Industries is prepared to offer a settlement that reflects both the genuine sorrow they feel for these losses and the practical reality of what the evidence supports." Dr. Chen's voice cut through Blackwell's presentation with surgical precision. "Mr. Blackwell, I've reviewed the preliminary materials you submitted, and I have some concerns about the completeness of your disclosure. Specifically, there appear to be gaps in the maintenance records from the 6 months preceding the explosion." Marcus felt his heart rate quicken. Dr. Chen was asking exactly the right questions, but he knew Blackwell was prepared for this line of inquiry. "I understand your concern, Dr. Chen," Blackwell replied smoothly. "Unfortunately, some records were destroyed in the explosion itself. The maintenance office was located in the section of the plant that suffered the most severe damage. We've provided everything that survived the incident. It was a masterful lie, delivered with the kind of conviction that came from years of practice." Marcus knew from the documents he'd seen that the maintenance office had been located in a completely different section of the plant, one that had suffered minimal damage. The missing records hadn't been destroyed by the explosion. They had been deliberately removed to hide evidence of Meridian Industries' negligence. "I see," Dr. Chen said, her tone neutral but skeptical. "And what about digital records? Surely a facility of this size would have maintained electronic backups of critical safety documentation." Marcus could almost hear Blackwell's smile in his response. Another casualty of the explosion, I'm afraid. The server room was located adjacent to the chemical storage area. The entire computer system was destroyed, along with all backups. It's a reminder of just how devastating this incident was. Another lie, another carefully constructed piece of the false narrative that would deny justice to 14 families and dozens of injured workers. Marcus felt the familiar burn of anger in his chest, but now it was tempered by something else, the cold certainty that Blackwell's lies were about to be exposed. The digital recorder hidden in Blackwell's briefcase had been running for nearly an hour, capturing every word of the presentation. But more importantly, it would capture what came next. The private conversations Blackwell would have with his team during the lunch break, the phone calls to Thomas Meridian, updating him on the mediators, questions, the unguarded moments when men like Richard Blackwell revealed their true character. As the morning session concluded and the mediators stepped out for a brief recess, Marcus heard Blackwell's voice take on a different quality, less polished, more predatory. "Tom," Blackwell said, obviously speaking into his phone, "it's going exactly as planned. Chen is asking the right questions, but she's buying our answers. Another couple of hours, and we'll have this wrapped up with minimal damage to your bottom line." Marcus closed his eyes and said a silent prayer for Elena, for the 14 families who deserve justice, and for the courage to see this through to the end. In 30 minutes, the afternoon session would begin, and Richard Blackwell would discover that sometimes the most dangerous witness is the one nobody sees coming. The lunch recess stretched into the afternoon like a held breath, with mediators reviewing documents in the building's executive dining room, while Richard Blackwell and his team regrouped in the conference room. The atmosphere was confident, almost celebratory. The morning session had gone exactly as planned, with every potential challenge deflected, and every awkward question answered with practiced ease. Marcus Williams remained in his hiding spot, listening through the thin wall as Blackwell's true personality emerged from behind his professional facade. With the mediators safely out of earshot, the man's carefully constructed mask of sympathy and corporate responsibility crumbled away like old paint. "I have to admit," Blackwell was saying to his team, "I was worried Chen might be more thorough in her questioning. But she's buying the whole narrative about destroyed records and unforeseeable equipment failures. These academic types are brilliant in theory, but they don't understand how the real world works." A junior associate, Marcus recognized the voices belonging to David Kim, a recent Harvard Law graduate, spoke up with obvious nervousness. "Sir, what if they asked to speak with some of the surviving workers directly? Some of them might contradict our version of events." Blackwell's laugh was cold and dismissive. "David, you're thinking like a law student instead of a lawyer. These people aren't going to risk their jobs by contradicting us. Half of them don't have high school educations, and the other half are so grateful to still have work that they'll say whatever we need them to say. Besides, Meridian has been very generous with severance packages for anyone who might have problematic memories of the safety protocols." The casual way Blackwell discussed witness intimidation and potential perjury made Marcus's stomach turn. This wasn't just legal maneuvering. It was a systematic corruption of the justice system, orchestrated by men who saw human suffering as nothing more than a public relations problem to be managed. "What about the family's attorneys?" another voice asked. Marcus thought it might be Jennifer Torres, one of Blackwell's senior associates. "Some of them seemed pretty sharp during the preliminary hearings." "Please," Blackwell scoffed. "They're working-class heroes who got lucky enough to pass the bar exam. They're good at generating sympathy and making emotional appeals, but this case is going to be won or lost on technical evidence and legal precedent. They simply don't have the resources or the expertise to challenge our narrative effectively." Marcus felt his hands clench into fists as he listened to Blackwell's arrogant dismissal of the lawyers fighting for the victims' families. These weren't working-class heroes who got lucky. They were dedicated professionals who genuinely cared about their clients and believed in the possibility of justice. The fact that they couldn't match Henderson and Associates' resources didn't make them inferior. It made them heroes for taking on such an unequal fight. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of Blackwell's phone ringing. Marcus pressed closer to the wall, hoping to catch both sides of what was obviously going to be an important call. "Tom, perfect timing," Blackwell answered. "I was just updating my team on our progress. The morning session couldn't have gone better." Thomas Meridian's voice came through the speakerphone with crystal clarity, and Marcus realized that the digital recorder hidden in Blackwell's briefcase was capturing every word. "Outstanding. What's your read on the mediators? Are they going to give us the outcome we need?" "Chen is professional but ultimately pragmatic. Blackwell replied, leaning back in his chair with obvious satisfaction. She'll recommend a settlement that reflects the evidence as presented, which means we're looking at minimal payouts that won't even register on your quarterly reports. Rodriguez and Walsh are following her lead. And there's no chance of them discovering the real maintenance records? Meridian asked, his voice carrying just a hint of nervousness. Blackwell's response was swift and confident. Tom, those records don't exist anymore. Your people were very thorough in their cleanup, and my people have been equally thorough in crafting a narrative that explains their absence. As far as the legal system is concerned, the explosion at your facility was an act of God, not an act of negligence. Marcus felt his heart pounding as he listened to this casual confession of evidence, destruction, and conspiracy. Every word was being captured by the recording device, creating an audio record that would be impossible to deny or explain away. What about the investigation by the Department of Labor? Meridian continued. I've been getting pressure from some senators who are asking uncomfortable questions. Handled. Blackwell replied with the confidence of a man who had never encountered a problem money couldn't solve. The investigation will conclude that while the explosion was tragic, it was ultimately the result of an unforeseeable equipment failure. The investigators will find no evidence of safety violations or corporate negligence because, officially, no such evidence exists. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Blackwell and Meridian discussing their strategy for managing media coverage, silencing potential whistleblowers, and ensuring that the problematic aspects of the case never saw the light of day. It was a masterclass in corporate corruption, delivered with the casual confidence of men who believed they were untouchable. As the call ended, and Blackwell's team began preparing for the afternoon session, Marcus finally allowed himself to move from his cramped position against the wall. His legs were stiff, and his back ached, but his mind was clear and focused on what needed to happen next. The afternoon session would be Blackwell's victory lap, a carefully orchestrated presentation designed to close the case with minimal financial impact on Meridian Industries. The mediators would hear compelling arguments about corporate responsibility and tragic accidents, supported by falsified evidence and manufactured testimony. They would recommend settlements that amounted to little more than nuisance payments, allowing Thomas Meridian to sleep soundly, while 14 families continued to struggle with their grief and financial devastation. Unless Marcus Williams decided to change the script. The digital recorder in Blackwell's briefcase now contained more than an hour of incriminating conversations, including direct confessions of evidence destruction, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to defraud the legal system. It was exactly the kind of evidence that could not only overturn the mediation, but potentially send both Blackwell and Meridian to federal prison. The question was no longer whether Marcus had the evidence to expose the conspiracy. He had more than enough. The question was whether he had the courage to step out of the shadows and become visible to people who had spent years pretending he didn't exist. As the mediators returned from their lunch break and took their seats in the conference room, Marcus Williams straightened his tie, checked the small recording device in his jacket pocket, and prepared to remind the world that sometimes justice comes from the most unexpected places. The afternoon session was about to begin, and Richard Blackwell was about to discover that his biggest mistake wasn't underestimating the mediators or the family's attorneys. It was underestimating the invisible man who had been listening all along. The afternoon session began with the same polished confidence that had characterized Blackwell's morning presentation. The mediators settled into their chairs with professional attention. Dr. Chen's sharp eyes focused on the documents spread across the conference table, while her colleagues prepared to hear Meridian Industries' final arguments. Marcus Williams stood in the corridor outside the conference room, his hand resting on the door handle as he listened to Blackwell's voice carry through the expensive wood paneling. The senior partner was building toward his closing argument, weaving together falsified evidence and manufactured testimony into a narrative designed to minimize his client's financial exposure. In conclusion, Blackwell was saying, his voice carrying the rhythmic cadence of a man who had delivered similar presentations hundreds of times, while we cannot bring back the 14 lives lost in this tragic accident, we can ensure that their families receive fair compensation that reflects both our compassion for their loss and the realistic limitations of corporate liability in cases involving unforeseeable equipment failures. Marcus took a deep breath and turned the handle. The conference room door opened silently on well-oiled hinges, and Marcus stepped into the space with the quiet dignity that had sustained him through 62 years of life's challenges. For a moment, nobody noticed his presence. All attention was focused on Blackwell's presentation and the documents spread across the mahogany table. Then Dr. Chen looked up, her expression shifting from polite attention to puzzled curiosity. "Excuse me," she said, her voice cutting through Blackwell's monologue. "I think we have a visitor." The room fell silent as every head turned toward Marcus. He stood in the doorway wearing his navy blue suit, his weathered hands folded respectfully in front of him, meeting their stares with the steady gaze of a man who had finally decided to step into the light. Richard Blackwell's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, and finally a cold anger that he struggled to mask in front of the mediators. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury, "but this is a private mediation session. You'll need to leave immediately." "Actually," Marcus said, his voice calm and clear, "I believe I have some information that's relevant to these proceedings." Dr. Chen leaned forward in her chair, her legal instincts immediately engaged. "Sir, could you please identify yourself and explain your interest in this case?" "My name is Marcus Williams," he replied, stepping fully into the room and closing the door behind him. "I work as a member of the night cleaning staff here at Henderson & Associates, and for the past several weeks I've been inadvertently overhearing conversations and observing documents that I believe these proceedings should take into account." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Blackwell's face had gone pale beneath his expensive tan, while his junior associates looked like deer caught in headlights. Thomas Rodriguez and Jennifer Walsh exchanged glances that suggested they were intrigued rather than annoyed by this unexpected development. "Mr. Williams," Dr. Chen continued, her voice maintaining its professional neutrality, "this is highly irregular. However, if you have evidence relevant to this case, we have an obligation to hear it. Mr. Blackwell, do you have any objection to allowing Mr. Williams to speak?" Blackwell's mind raced as he calculated his options. Refusing to allow Marcus to speak would raise immediate suspicions, but allowing him to continue could expose everything they had worked so carefully to conceal. "Dr. Chen," he said, forcing his voice to remain steady, "I must object to this irregular procedure. Mr. Williams is an employee of this firm, and any statements he might make could be influenced by his employment relationship. Furthermore, he has no legal standing in these proceedings." "With respect, Mr. Blackwell," Dr. Chen replied, her tone suggesting that she had dealt with obstructionist attorneys before, "Mr. Williams is not a party to this mediation, which means he has no financial interest in the outcome. That actually makes his testimony potentially more credible, not less. Mr. Williams, please proceed." Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the small digital recorder, setting it gently on the conference table. The device seemed impossibly small in the vast space, but its presence commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "Over the past several weeks," Marcus began, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I've overheard conversations and seen documents that suggest the evidence being presented in this mediation is incomplete and, in some cases, deliberately falsified." Blackwell shot to his feet, his professional composure finally cracking. "This is outrageous! Dr. Chen, I demand that you put a stop to this. Mr. Williams has no legal training, no understanding of the complexities of this case, and no right to disrupt these proceedings with wild accusations." "Mr. Blackwell, please sit down," Dr. Chen said firmly. "Mr. Williams, these are serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support what you're saying?" Marcus nodded toward the recorder. "Last Tuesday evening, I overheard a phone conversation between Mr. Blackwell and someone he addressed as Tom, who I believe is Thomas Meridian, the CEO of Meridian Industries. During that conversation, they discussed the deliberate removal of safety inspection reports that documented equipment failures in the months before the explosion. The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Jennifer Walsh leaned forward, her expression intense. "Mr. Williams, are you saying that you have a recording of this conversation?" "No, ma'am," Marcus replied. "But this morning, before this mediation began, I placed a recording device in Mr. Blackwell's briefcase. For the past 3 hours, it has been capturing conversations that I believe will be of great interest to this panel." If the room had been quiet before, it was now silent as a tomb. Blackwell's face had gone from pale to ashen, while his associates looked like they were witnessing the end of their careers in real time. Dr. Chen's expression remained neutral, but Marcus could see the sharp intelligence in her eyes as she processed the implications of what he was saying. "Mr. Blackwell," Dr. Chen said slowly, Is there a recording device in your briefcase? Blackwell's gaze darted between the mediators and his briefcase, which sat on the table not 3 feet from where Marcus had placed the recorder. This is completely inappropriate. Even if such a device exists, any recordings made without consent would be inadmissible in any legal proceeding. Mr. Blackwell, Thomas Rodriguez interjected, this is not a trial. It's a mediation. The rules of evidence are more flexible here, especially when it comes to issues of potential fraud or misconduct. Marcus stepped forward and reached for Blackwell's briefcase, but the attorney's hand shot out to stop him. Don't you dare touch my property? Blackwell snarled, his mask of professionalism completely gone now. Mr. Blackwell, Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the authority of a former federal judge, I'm going to ask you to open your briefcase and allow us to examine its contents. If you refuse, I will have to assume that you have something to hide, and I will recommend that these proceedings be suspended pending a formal investigation. For a long moment, Blackwell stared at the briefcase as if it were a bomb that might explode at any moment. Then, with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, he opened the brass clasps and lifted the lid. The recording device was exactly where Marcus had placed it, nestled behind the leather lining and nearly invisible unless someone knew where to look. Dr. Chen reached into the briefcase and carefully extracted the device, holding it up for everyone to see. Mr. Williams, she said, how do we access the recordings on this device? Marcus walked to the recorder and pressed a small button on its side. Immediately, the room filled with the sound of Blackwell's voice from earlier that morning, crystal clear and utterly damning. Tom, it's going exactly as planned. Chen is asking the right questions, but she's buying our answers. Another couple of hours, and we'll have this wrapped up with minimal damage to your bottom line. The voice of Thomas Meridian came through the small speaker with perfect clarity. Outstanding. What's your read on the mediators? Are they going to give us the outcome we need? As the recording continued, playing back nearly 3 hours of conversations that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy between Henderson and Associates in Meridian Industries, Marcus watched the faces around the conference table. Dr. Chen's expression grew darker with each revealed detail of evidence destruction and witness intimidation. Rodriguez and Walsh took careful notes, their pens moving rapidly across their legal pads. The junior associates stared at the table as if they could will themselves to disappear. But it was Richard Blackwell's face that held Marcus's attention. The man who had dismissed him as an uneducated janitor, whose biggest career achievement was learning which end of a mop to hold, now looked like he was watching his entire world collapse in real time. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperation that was almost pitiful to witness. When the recording reached the conversation about the families, attorneys being working-class heroes who got lucky enough to pass the bar exam, Dr. Chen finally spoke. Stop the recording, she said quietly. The room fell silent again, but now it was the silence of a courtroom after a devastating verdict had been read. Marcus felt a strange mixture of vindication and sadness as he looked around at the faces of the people who had spent years pretending he didn't exist. Mr. Blackwell, Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of legal experience. In 30 years of practicing law and mediating corporate disputes, I have never encountered such a blatant example of fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. These proceedings are hereby suspended, and I will be recommending that the Department of Justice open a formal criminal investigation into both Henderson and Associates in Meridian Industries. Blackwell seemed to age 10 years in as many seconds. Dr. Chen, please, let me explain. Mr. Blackwell, she cut him off. I strongly advise you to contact your attorney. You're going to need one. Marcus Williams stood quietly in the corner of the conference room, watching as the most powerful people in Chicago's legal community scrambled to deal with the consequences of their actions. For 3 years, he had been invisible to them, just another piece of furniture to be ignored while they conducted their important business. Today, he had reminded them that sometimes the most important witness is the one nobody sees coming. The news broke before the sun set over Chicago's skyline. By 6 o'clock that evening, every major news outlet in the city was leading with the story of Henderson and Associates' spectacular downfall, and the janitor who had brought down one of the most prestigious law firms in the Midwest. Marcus Williams sat in his modest apartment in Bronzeville, watching the coverage on his small television with a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. The past 6 hours had been a whirlwind of activity, statements to federal investigators, interviews with prosecutors, and phone calls from reporters who wanted to hear his story firsthand. Through it all, he had maintained the same quiet dignity that had carried him through 62 years of life's challenges. The telephone rang for the 15th time that evening, but this call was different. The voice on the other end belonged to his daughter Sarah, calling from her hospital in Milwaukee, where she worked as a pediatric nurse. "Dad," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I just saw the news. I can't believe what you did today. Mom would be so proud of you." Marcus felt his eyes moisten at the mention of Elena. His late wife had always believed that one person could make a difference, that standing up for what was right was more important than personal safety or comfort. Today, he had finally lived up to her example. "I just did what needed to be done, sweetheart," he replied, settling back into his worn armchair. "Those families deserve better than what they were getting." "Dad, the reporters are saying that Richard Blackwell could face 20 years in federal prison, and that the families might receive settlements worth hundreds of millions of dollars instead of the pittance they were being offered. You changed everything." Marcus nodded, though Sarah couldn't see him. The recording he had captured had done more than expose a single case of corruption. It had opened the floodgates for a federal investigation that was already expanding to include other cases handled by Henderson and Associates. Prosecutors were reviewing years of settlements and verdicts, looking for patterns of evidence tampering and witness intimidation. But for Marcus, the real victory wasn't measured in prison sentences or financial settlements. It was measured in the phone call he'd received that afternoon from Maria Santos, the widow of one of the workers killed in the Meridian Industries explosion. "Mr. Williams," she had said through tears, "I don't know how to thank you. For months, I've been watching these lawyers treat my husband's death like it was just a number on a spreadsheet. Today, you reminded them that he was a human being who deserved justice." That phone call had meant more to Marcus than all the news coverage and federal investigations combined. 14 families would finally have their day in court, and dozens of injured workers would receive the compensation they deserved. More importantly, the truth about corporate negligence and safety violations would finally see the light of day, potentially preventing future tragedies. The story had taken on a life of its own, spreading far beyond Chicago as national news outlets picked up the tale of the janitor, who had brought down a corrupt law firm. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #InvisibleNoMore, while editorial writers across the country used his story to discuss issues of corporate accountability and working-class heroism. But perhaps the most significant response had come from an unexpected source. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, as Marcus was finishing his statement to federal investigators, his phone had rung with a call from the office of Senator Elizabeth Warren. The senator wanted to invite him to testify before a congressional committee investigating corporate corruption and the need for stronger whistleblower protections. "Mr. Williams," the senator's aide had explained, "your story illustrates perfectly why we need better safeguards for workers who witness corporate wrongdoing. Too often, the people who see these crimes are afraid to speak up because they fear retaliation. Your courage could help change that." Marcus had agreed to consider the invitation, though the idea of testifying before Congress still seemed surreal. 6 months ago, he had been an invisible janitor whose opinions mattered to no one. Now, senators wanted to hear his thoughts on corporate reform and worker protection. As the evening wore on and the news coverage continued, Marcus found himself thinking about the other invisible workers in office buildings across the country, the cleaning staff, security guards, and maintenance workers who saw and heard things that powerful people assumed no one would notice. How many other conspiracies were being planned behind closed doors, protected only by the assumption that the help didn't matter? His phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Marcus almost didn't answer, assuming it was another reporter, but something made him pick up. "Mr. Williams?" The voice was young, nervous, and unfamiliar. "My name is David Kim. I was one of the junior associates in that conference room today." Marcus remembered the young man, a recent Harvard law graduate who had looked increasingly uncomfortable as the day's events unfolded. "What can I do for you, Mr. Kim?" "I wanted to thank you," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I wanted you to know that some of us weren't comfortable with what was happening. I graduated from law school because I believed in justice, not because I wanted to help corporations cover up their crimes." But I was scared to speak up, scared of losing my job, scared of what Mr. Blackwell might do to my career. Marcus felt a wave of sympathy for the young man. He had been in similar positions throughout his life, knowing that something was wrong but feeling powerless to do anything about it. Fear is a powerful thing, son, but so is courage, and you showed courage today by calling me. I've been thinking about what you said to the mediators, David continued, about how the families deserve better than what they were getting. You're right, and I want to help make it right. I've been keeping copies of documents that I thought might be important someday. Documents that show this wasn't the only case where evidence was destroyed or witnesses were intimidated. Marcus felt his heart rate quicken. If David Kim had additional evidence of systematic corruption at Henderson and Associates, it could expand the federal investigation even further and potentially help other victims who had been denied justice. Mr. Kim, Marcus said carefully, have you spoken to the federal investigators about these documents? Not yet, David replied. But I'm going to. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to walk into the FBI office and tell them everything I know. I just wanted to call you first, to thank you for showing me what courage looks like. After the call ended, Marcus sat in his quiet apartment and reflected on the day that had changed everything. This morning, he had been Marcus Williams, invisible janitor. Tonight, he was Marcus Williams, whistleblower, hero, and symbol of hope for working people everywhere. But more than that, he was still Marcus Williams, a man who had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to remain silent in the face of injustice. Elena would have been proud, not just of what he had accomplished, but of the man he had always been, someone who understood that dignity came not from how others saw you, but from how you saw yourself and how you treated others. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new interviews, and new opportunities to ensure that the truth he had exposed would lead to meaningful change. But tonight, Marcus Williams was content to sit in his chair, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing he had done the right thing at exactly the right moment. The invisible man was invisible no more. 6 months later, Marcus Williams stood at the podium in the Hart Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C., looking out at a room filled with senators, reporters, and advocates for worker rights. The marble columns and ornate ceiling reminded him of Henderson and Associates, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Here his voice mattered. Here his story would help shape legislation that could protect other whistleblowers for generations to come. Chairman Brown, Ranking Member Scott, members of the committee, Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. 6 months ago, I was a janitor whose existence was largely ignored by the powerful people who made decisions in the building where I worked. Today, I stand before you not as a hero, but as a representative of the millions of working Americans who see injustice every day, but feel powerless to speak out against it. The hearing room was packed with spectators, including several family members of the workers killed in the Meridian Industries explosion. Maria Santos sat in the front row, her eyes bright with tears as she listened to Marcus describe the conspiracy that had nearly denied her family justice. The Meridian Industries case had become a watershed moment in corporate accountability. Richard Blackwell was currently serving a 15-year sentence in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Thomas Meridian had received 12 years and been ordered to pay $500 million in restitution to the victims' families. Henderson and Associates had been dissolved, its assets liquidated to help pay the settlements that ultimately totaled more than $800 million. But the ripple effects had extended far beyond a single case. David Kim's cache of documents had exposed a pattern of corruption that spanned dozens of cases over nearly a decade. Families who had been pressured into accepting inadequate settlements years earlier were now receiving additional compensation as the full scope of Henderson and Associates' misconduct came to light. More importantly, the case had sparked a national conversation about the treatment of working-class witnesses and the need for stronger protections for people who exposed corporate wrongdoing. The legislation being considered by the Senate committee would create new legal safeguards for employees who reported criminal activity, regardless of their position or educational background. The current system, Marcus continued, his testimony drawing from months of preparation with congressional staff and victim advocacy groups, assumes that only people with law degrees and business cards deserve to be taken seriously when they report wrongdoing. But some of the most important witnesses to corporate crime are the people who clean the offices, guard the buildings, and maintain the equipment where these crimes are planned and executed. Senator Warren, who had been instrumental in arranging Marcus's testimony, leaned forward at the committee table. Mr. Williams, in your experience, how often do you think working-class employees witness evidence of corporate misconduct but don't report it because they fear retaliation? Marcus thought carefully before answering. Senator, in my 37 years of working, I've seen things that would shock the American people. Safety violations that put workers at risk, financial fraud that steals from pension funds, environmental crimes that poison communities. Most of the time, the people who see these things don't report them because they know they'll be fired, blacklisted, or worse. The Meridian case only came to light because I was fortunate enough to be in the right place at the right time with the right tools to document what I was seeing. And that, Senator Warren replied, is exactly why we need the protections outlined in this legislation. No worker should have to choose between their livelihood and their conscience. As the hearing continued, Marcus found his thoughts drifting to the events that had brought him to this moment. The night shift janitor who had been invisible to powerful men was now sitting in the United States Senate, helping to write laws that would protect other invisible workers across the country. The personal cost had been significant. Marcus had been forced to leave his job at Henderson and Associates, though not before receiving a settlement that ensured his financial security for the rest of his life. He had been hailed as a hero by some and vilified as a traitor by others, particularly in corporate circles where his actions were seen as a dangerous precedent. But the benefits far outweighed the costs. The 14 families affected by the Meridian explosion had received justice and financial compensation that would help them rebuild their lives. Dozens of other families had received additional settlements as the full scope of Henderson and Associates' corruption was exposed. And most importantly, the case had sent a clear message to corporate America that their crimes would not go unnoticed or unpunished, regardless of how carefully they thought they had covered their tracks. During a break in the hearing, Marcus was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Rebecca Martinez, the daughter of one of the workers killed in the Meridian explosion. "Mr. Williams," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I wanted to thank you for what you did. My father was everything to our family, and when he died, we thought the people responsible would never be held accountable. You gave us justice, but more than that, you gave us our dignity back." Marcus felt his own eyes moisten as he shook the young woman's hand. "Your father was a good man who deserved better than what happened to him. I'm just glad I could help ensure that his death wasn't in vain." As the hearing resumed and Marcus completed his testimony, he reflected on the journey that had brought him from the shadows of a corporate law firm to the halls of Congress. The invisible janitor had become a symbol of hope for working people everywhere, proof that one person with courage and determination could still make a difference in a world that often seemed dominated by corporate power and political corruption. But Marcus Williams knew that his story was just the beginning. Across the country, in office buildings and factories and warehouses, there were other invisible workers who witnessed injustice every day. Some of them would find the courage to speak out, inspired by his example and protected by the new laws being crafted in hearing rooms like this one. The legislation would pass 6 weeks later, signed into law by a president who praised Marcus Williams as an American hero who reminded us that justice doesn't depend on your title or your bank account, but on your willingness to do what's right when it matters most. For Marcus, the real victory wasn't the congressional hearing or the new legislation, or even the criminal convictions of Richard Blackwell and Thomas Meridian. The real victory was the knowledge that 14 families had received justice, that dozens of injured workers had been fairly compensated, and that other workers would be better protected when they witnessed corporate wrongdoing in the future. As he prepared to return to Chicago that evening, Marcus thought about Elena and the pride she would have felt seeing him stand up for the values they had shared throughout their marriage. He thought about his daughter Sarah, who had taken leave from her nursing job to attend the hearing and support her father. Most of all, he thought about the millions of invisible workers across America who deserved to be seen, heard, and protected when they had the courage to speak truth to power. What moment in this story resonated with you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this narrative, please subscribe to my channel. Your support means the world to me and helps keep these stories coming.